Picture a man who arrived in southern Italy with almost nothing. No title. No land. No army. Just a horse, a sword, and a reputation for ruthlessness that had followed him all the way from Normandy. Within 30 years, he had conquered half the Italian peninsula, carved a kingdom out of Muslim Sicily, put 2 emperors to flight, and held the most powerful pope of the Middle Ages prisoner in his own palace. He wasn't born into greatness. He clawed his way to it, one burned harvest at a time. His name was Robert de Hauteville, but history remembers him by the name his enemies gave him, Guiscard, the wily one, Robert Guiscard. To understand Robert Guiscard, you first have to understand what southern Italy looked like in 1046. This wasn't the peaceful, unified country we know today. It was a patchwork of collapsing empires, Lombard princes who'd been stabbing each other in the back for centuries, Byzantine governors clinging to their coastal cities by their fingernails, and the crumbling remnants of a Muslim emirate across the strait in Sicily, tearing itself apart from within. Nobody was in charge. Everybody was fighting everybody. And that's exactly when the Normans showed up. The sons of Tancred de Hauteville, a minor lord from Normandy with far too many boys and not nearly enough land to give them, had been trickling into southern Italy since the 1030s. They came as mercenaries. They stayed as conquerors. By the time Robert arrived, several of his brothers had already carved out territory in Puglia, but they were building something fragile, contested, and perpetually under threat. Robert was different from his brothers. More calculating, more patient, and far more willing to do what needed to be done. This is the story of how a small-time brigand from the mountains of Calabria became the most feared man in the Mediterranean world, and what he left behind in the land that still bears his mark today. Robert Guiscard arrived in Calabria around 1047. He was probably in his early 30s. The exact year is uncertain because, frankly, nobody thought he was important enough to write it down yet. He had no inheritance from his father's modest estate in Normandy. What he had was a small band of followers, maybe 60 men, and a stretch of Calabrian wilderness that nobody else seemed to want. He based himself in the mountains south of Cosenza, in terrain so rugged and broken that even the Byzantines had trouble projecting authority there. He set up camp and he improvised. The stories that survive from these years paint a portrait worth pausing over. Robert and his men would ride out and burn the crops of local farmers. Not out of pure cruelty, though cruelty was certainly available, but as a business model. Once the fields were burning, Robert would offer to protect the farmers from further raids. For a fee, he was running the oldest protection racket in history, and he was running it with the strategic clarity of someone who understood exactly what he was doing. Was this banditry? Absolutely. But here's the thing about Calabria in the 1040s. The line between bandit and lord was thinner than a sword's edge. The region was too fragmented, too contested, too caught between competing powers for anyone to maintain real order. Robert didn't just survive in that chaos. He studied it. He mapped it. He learned which local lords were vulnerable, which Byzantine commanders were overstretched, and where the cracks were opening. Gradually, he built something real, a castle at Scribla, then one at San Marco Argentano, small fortifications, rough-cut stone on hilltops overlooking the valleys, but fortifications nonetheless. Each one was a claim. Each claim was a step toward legitimacy. He raided, yes. But he also negotiated. He traded threats for alliances. He made deals. The Lombard princes around him dismissed him as a troublemaker. The Byzantine chronicles describe him with barely concealed contempt. But they all had to deal with him because Robert Guiscard possessed one quality that his rivals consistently underestimated, at their own cost. He never stopped moving forward. The moment that changed everything came in the summer of 1059, in the hilltop town of Melfi. Melfi sits in the highlands of what is now Basilicata, a volcanic landscape of eroded ravines and wind-scraped plateaus, about an hour's drive south of Potenza. Today, it's a quiet place, dominated by a massive Norman castle that seems to grow out of the rock itself. In 1059, it was the political heart of Norman power in southern Italy. And that summer, it became the site of one of the most audacious political transactions of the Middle Ages. Pope Nicholas II was in trouble. The papacy was fighting for its survival, battling the Holy Roman Emperor in the north, struggling against the Roman nobility, who kept trying to control the election of popes. He needed allies, and he was willing to find them in unexpected places. He convened a council at Melfi and, in a ceremony that would have seemed almost surreal to any objective observer, the head of the Christian Church, the successor to St. Peter, forging an alliance with a Norman warlord who had spent the last decade burning peasants' crops. Pope Nicholas II invested Robert de Hauteville with the title of Duke of Puglia, Calabria, and future Duke of Sicily, Sicily, an island that had been under Muslim rule for over 200 years, an island the Normans did not yet control. Nicholas was essentially handing Robert a promissory note for a conquest that hadn't happened yet. For Robert, this was a transformation. He knelt before the Pope, swore fealty, and stood up a duke. He was no longer a brigand chieftain squatting in mountain castles. He had the blessing, the mandate, of the most powerful institution in the Western world, and now he had a brother to fight alongside him. Roger de Hauteville had arrived from Normandy around 1056, young and brilliant and hungry for everything the oldest sons back home would never give him. Where Robert was cunning and relentless, Roger was patient and precise. Together, they were unstoppable. In 1060, they captured Reggio Calabria, the last Byzantine stronghold on the Italian mainland. They stood at the water's edge and looked south across the Strait of Messina, 3 kilometers of open water, and beyond it, the green hills of Sicily. It was time to collect on their papal promissory note. The invasion of Sicily launched in the spring of 1061, and it launched small, almost unbelievably small. Robert and Roger crossed the strait with roughly 160 knights and a few hundred foot soldiers. Understand what that means. This was the force with which they intended to conquer an island of hundreds of thousands of people, defended by Muslim emirs who had held it for 2 centuries. The reason this wasn't entirely suicidal was that Sicily was, at that precise moment, devouring itself. The island's ruling emirs had fractured into rival factions locked in a brutal civil war. One of them, Ibn al-Thumna, lord of eastern Sicily, had actually reached out to the Normans, hoping to use them as a weapon against his own rivals. It was exactly the kind of opening that Robert Guiscard had spent his entire adult life learning to recognize and exploit. They landed at a beach called Tremestieri, just south of Messina. The city fell quickly. They pushed south. Milazzo, Petralia, then Troina, a siege that stretched through a brutal Sicilian winter, with Norman knights and their wives huddled together for warmth in a half-conquered mountain town, surviving on whatever they could find. Progress was agonizing. The island kept fighting back. This was not going to be a quick victory. It was going to be a generation-long project. The conquest of Sicily would take 30 years. 30 years of raids and sieges, truces and betrayals, brilliant maneuvers and desperate retreats. Robert couldn't be there for most of it. He was perpetually being pulled back to the mainland. Revolts in Puglia, a campaign against the Byzantine emperor, and in one episode that still seems almost impossible to believe, Robert fought Pope Gregory VII himself, forced him out of Rome, and took him prisoner. The man who had been made a duke by one pope ended up capturing the next one. Such was the career of Robert Guiscard. The fall of Palermo in 1072 was the turning point of the entire enterprise. Robert rode into the greatest city in the Western Mediterranean, a place of Arab palaces, bustling souks, fountains and gardens, and noticed, almost hidden among the splendor, a small Christian church, half forgotten, barely standing. He ordered it rebuilt immediately. It was a gesture that tells you everything about how Robert now saw himself. Not just a conqueror, but a restorer. A man bringing something back to a land that had lost it. He left Palermo shortly afterward, extracting a substantial tribute from the city's inhabitants to cover his expenses, naturally. And he never returned. The completion of Sicily's conquest fell to his brother Roger, who became Roger I, Count of Sicily, founder of a kingdom that would one day rank among the most sophisticated civilizations in Europe. Robert gave Roger the island. He just never quite got around to finishing it himself. Robert Guiscard died in 1085, on the Greek island of Cephalonia, struck down by a typhus epidemic while leading a campaign against the Byzantine Empire. He was in his late 60s. His lifelong dream, the conquest of Constantinople itself, a plan so audacious it makes everything else he did seem modest, died with him on that distant island shore. He had put 2 emperors to flight. He had held a pope captive. He had remade the map of the Mediterranean, and he died as he had lived, in motion, aiming at something just beyond his reach. Today, the traces of his world are scattered across a southern Italian landscape that most visitors drive through without stopping, but they are there, waiting, if you know where to look. Melfi, in Basilicata, still has the Norman castle, rebuilt over the centuries, but standing on the same volcanic rock where the 1059 Council changed history. Walk its walls and look out over the Badlands, stretching toward the horizon. The local museum holds Norman artifacts found nowhere else in the region. An hour away, in Venosa, the ancient Roman city of the poet Horace, you'll find La Trinità, an unfinished church of extraordinary beauty, where several of the Hauteville brothers rest in ancient Roman sarcophagi. It's one of the most quietly moving places in all of southern Italy. Norman conquerors buried in Roman stone, in a place that feels like the edge of the known world. In Mileto, in Calabria, the ruins of the church that Robert himself founded still stand, where, according to tradition, his remains were eventually brought to rest. These aren't tourist traps. They're quiet places, off the main roads, mostly overlooked by the guidebooks. Places where the past hasn't been packaged and sold. It's just there, stone and silence, waiting to be found. 7 centuries before Norwich ever picked up a pen, Dante Alighieri had already made his judgment. In the Paradiso, his vision of heaven, Dante imagined the souls of the greatest warriors of Christendom, moving through the heaven of Mars like stars tracing a cross of light. He watched them pass, one by one, and named them: Charlemagne, Roland, Godfrey of Bouillon, leader of the First Crusade, and Robert Guiscard, the man who showed up in the mountains of Calabria with 60 men and no title. In paradise, numbered among the greatest warriors in the history of Christendom. Dante didn't write that as a compliment. He wrote it as a fact. The English historian John Julius Norwich, who spent a lifetime writing about the Normans of southern Italy, called Robert Guiscard a giant blonde buccaneer who not only forged the most extraordinary career of the entire Middle Ages, but who, without false shame, enjoyed it. That's the thing about Guiscard. He wasn't complicated. He didn't pretend to be something he wasn't. He wanted power, he took it, and he made no apologies. In a world of hypocrites and pretenders, there is something almost clarifying about that kind of honesty. If you want to understand why the south of Italy is the way it is, why its history is so layered, so tangled, so unlike anywhere else in Europe, you could do a lot worse than starting here, with the wily one, with the man who arrived with nothing and remade a world. If this story reached you, subscribe. There's much more where this came from. Next time, we're going underground. We're going back 2,000 years to a Greek city so obscenely wealthy, so drunk on its own luxury, that its very name became a word for decadence. It was called Sybaris, and then, one day, it simply vanished, almost without a trace. Let's go looking for it.